Hi, everyone. Today is September 20th, 2024, and we have a special guest back on the show, Abayomi Azikiwe. Abayomi Azikiwe is the editor of the Pan-African Newswire. Azikiwe is a graduate of Wayne State University in Detroit, holding undergraduate and graduate degrees in political economy, along with organizational and administrative studies. Ezekiel has worked for several decades in solidarity with various liberation movements and progressive movements in Africa, the Caribbean, and other geopolitical regions. He also serves as a political analyst for various satellite television networks and other press agencies internationally. Welcome, Mr. Ezekiel, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. And so today we wanted to talk to you about the critically important must-read article that you wrote in Black Agenda Report entitled Instability in Somalia Endangers the Entire Horn of Africa. It was published on September 11th, 2024. For those in the audience that may not be aware, can you please provide some background into what is going on in Somalia today, particularly as it relates to Somaliland?
Over the last several decades, the Somali state has undergone tremendous destabilization. We can go back to the early 1990s, 1991, for example, when you had the complete collapse of the Mohammed Siad Barre regime in Somalia, which was a military regime. And after that, there was a huge internal struggle over control of the national government and resources. During that process, there was the break-off, declared independence of the Somaliland region in the north. And later, there was the break-off of an area called Puntland, also in the north. After that occurred, you had successive attempts to form a national government. We all know, hopefully, about the interventions of the African Union mission in Somalia, which began around 2006, late 2006, became more institutionalized in 2007. They have been there in one form or another since 2007. At this point, there's the mission of stabilization in Somalia. But it will be very difficult to stabilize the country without the total defeat or some political agreement with al-Shabaab, and at the same time with these internal problems. Now, the divisions in Somalia has resulted in an agreement between the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, which is a neighbor of Somalia, also on the Horn of Africa, and the government, de facto government in Somaliland, that Ethiopia, which is a landlocked country, the way it is constituted today, has access to the Red Sea. So this is the whole crisis that has developed. The Somaliland government forming an alliance with Ethiopia, Ethiopia recognizing them as a sovereign state, and at the same time, the federal Somalian government based in Mogadishu objecting to this. So this is part of the problem that's being caused between Somalia and neighboring Ethiopia, but at the same time, it is based upon the fragmentation of the Somalian state over the last 30 plus years.
Thank you for that. And to dig a little bit deeper, the Memorandum of Understanding signed between Ethiopia and Somaliland has been a major point of contention, to your point. At a time when conflict over the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden is intensifying in the Arabian Peninsula to its north, another potential conflict, right, is brewing on the southern side of these troubled waters in the Horn of Africa, as you were just speaking to. And so I wanted to ask, how does Ethiopia's recognition of Somaliland, as you mentioned, as an independent state impact the dynamics in the Horn of Africa? And what might be the long-term consequences for Ethiopia's Somalia relations?
Yes, it's causing tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia. We also have a situation where the Egyptian government has made a military agreement with Somalia, which is a threat to the relations between between Ethiopia and Egypt, because there's a huge disagreement between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Grand Renaissance Dam project, which is an Ethiopian project that's designed to provide hydroelectric power to the country and also the neighboring countries. But it deals with redirecting the flow of the Blue Nile, one of the most important waterways on the African continent. So this is a very another dimension of this whole conflict, the tension between Egypt and Ethiopia, and how that plays out in regard to Ethiopia signing the memorandum of understanding with Somaliland. Also, you have Puntland, which is another area which has declared its independence. But at this point, neither Puntland or Somaliland has been recognized by the United Nations, by the African Union, and I don't believe they've been recognized by any other government in the world. So this is somewhat of an unprecedented circumstance that is developing right now. Now, you mentioned the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, the Arabian Sea. We all know that the Yemeni armed forces, which is right across the Red Sea from the Horn of Africa, has, in fact, set up a blockade to stop any Israeli-linked vessels from entering that region, whether it be Israeli-owned, Israeli-flagged, or conducting business with the State of Israel. So this has caused the United States to step up its intervention in the area. They've carried out airstrikes against Yemen. So has the Israeli Defense Forces, because they're holding up vessels from conducting trade at the port of Eilat, which is a very important port for the State of Israel. So it's a very complex and a very high stakes and intense situation that exists in that region, from the Horn of Africa across to the Arabian Peninsula and West Asia, and then going up, of course, to occupied Palestine in that same region.
Indeed. Your article also importantly mentions the colonial origins of the crisis between Somaliland and Puntland. As you mentioned earlier, can you provide some insight into how the colonial partitioning of Africa continues to shape the current political and territorial disputes in Somalia?
Yes, you had the British, you had the Italians, and you also had the French, all claiming regions of what is today considered Somalia. So you had the Somaliland region being controlled by one of those colonial powers, Puntland being controlled by another, and the French, what we used to be determined called French Somaliland, is now Djibouti, which is also in the Horn of Africa, where the United States has thousands upon thousands of U.S. African Command troops there, along with France. France also has troops in Djibouti at a place called Camp Les Monaires. Now, China has, in fact, Djibouti and China made an agreement to open up some type of military arrangements in the same region, but the Chinese they have far less troops than France and the United States. So here we have a situation where well over 125 years, 130 years later, these colonial partitioning agreements are still impacting military presence. They are impacting political and social tensions between the various regions of the country. Now, you had Italy, you had Britain, and you had France. But at the same time, Kenya has a huge Somali population as well. And so does certain regions in southern Ethiopia. So the Somali diaspora, if you will, on the continent is spread out to between 5 different countries, all of whom their current borders are a direct result of the Berlin Conference and other agreements from 1884 all the way up to the present. So many Somalians will point out that their people are scattered out between 5 different countries. And all of this is a result of colonial partitioning that, of course, was done by Germany, Britain, Italy. The United States was involved. However, since World War II, as we know, the U.S. has become the #1 imperialist power around the globe. So it's very difficult for any of the other imperialist powers to assert their so-called interests without the approval of the United States. And we've seen repeatedly since the late 1970s direct State Department and military intervention in Somalia. We could talk about the Ogaden War of the late 1970s, where the United States under President Jimmy Carter encouraged one of the Somalian liberation fronts, the Western Somalian Liberation Front, and the central government under then military President Siad Barre, to launch a war of succession against Ethiopia. And it was disastrous because the Somalians suffered tremendous defeat. And the U.S. indicated they would intervene militarily against them, and they did not. At that time, you had Cuban internationalist troops that were stationed in Ethiopia. That was the time of Mengistu's government. The Ethiopian government, between the mid-1970s up to the early 1990s, had a socialist orientation. They had strong links with the former Soviet Union, the German Democratic Republic, and as I mentioned, the Cuban Republic of Cuba had internationalist forces there to deal with their security threats. So that was disastrous in the late 70s. As a result of that, it weakened the government of Siad Barre. And then by the early 1990s, his government had dissolved, and you had another struggle that took place. Now, the United States in 1992 intervened militarily in Somalia, ostensibly for humanitarian reasons. Well, that turned out to be a disaster because the Somalian people rose up against the U.S. and the United Nations occupation between 1992 and early 1994. They were forced to withdraw militarily from the Horn of Africa. But despite these defeats, the U.S. has still sought to control the sovereignty, political, and economic direction of Somalia.
Yeah, thank you for that very rich answer. And yeah, as you mentioned, the U.S. continues to exercise great influence in Somalia, including Somaliland. Right now, the U.S. has over 900 troops in a drone bombing operation in Somalia. We're told, right, to combat this so-called extremist group, Al-Shabaab, and it appears that the U.S. may be trying to use Somaliland to weaken Somalia. So, what is your assessment for why the U.S. is trying to divide and weaken Somalia? Is it playing one side off of or against the other?
Yes. What has happened is that the Al-Shabaab group, which really evolved out of the Islamic Courts Union of the mid-2000s, that was an alliance of various community and national organizations trying to recuperate from the U.S. and UN intervention of the previous decade. They were bringing together a lot of different factions in Somalia, and apparently the U.S. saw this as a threat, and they encouraged the then government in Ethiopia, which was headed by a man named Meles Zenawi, who has since passed away, and the government that he ran was overthrown in 2018. Nonetheless, during that period of time, they sent in Ethiopian troops that were supported by the U.S. Then later they sent in Kenyan troops. And of course, there was a whole resistance to that inside of Somalia. And then, of course, they came up with the African Union mission in Somalia. And this went on for years. And then, of course, many of the political forces inside the Union of Islamic Courts eventually, through negotiations, joined the federal government. However, Al-Shabaab held out, and they pledged their allegiance eventually to Al Qaeda and another faction to ISIS. There's been tremendous advances, it appears, by the Somalian National Army against the Al-Shabaab groupings. However, they have not been totally defeated. And I believe that this factionalism that is resurfacing between Somaliland and the central government could be a mechanism for destabilizing the country again, even though politically and diplomatically the United States says they support the central government in Mogadishu. But we've seen these types of maneuvers before, where the U.S. has supported rebel organizations in order to justify their own presence in these particular countries. We saw and are seeing unfold in the Sahel region in West Africa, where they are being expelled in Burkina Faso and Niger and in Mali. And they've set up their own security network in consultation with the Russian Federation. So we have to watch very closely how this situation unfolds in Somalia. Just could be another spark to set off another regional conflict in the Horn of Africa.
Absolutely. So in comparison to the United States response to the Memorandum of Understanding between Ethiopia and Somaliland, what was China's response?
I'm not sure what the U.S. or China's response has been. Typically, the People's Republic of China does not get involved in internal conflicts in various African states. Now, I'm not sure if they have offered to mediate between the two countries or the two regions of the same country. The United States, it's not clear to me what the State Department's position is on this question. I believe that they would be concerned about potential eruption of conflict inside Somalia or between Somalia and Ethiopia. But we'll have to check the State Department's website to see if they issued a statement on it.
Definitely. And Somalia remains internally fragmented. What do you see as being the primary challenges preventing the establishment of a unified and secure Somali state? And how do these divisions benefit or hinder imperialist interests in the region?
Yes, the divisions serve to justify imperialist military presence and also justify arms embargoes and other forms of diplomatic pressure, so they yield to the wishes and desires of U.S. and European imperialism. The internal conflicts inside the country are largely based upon the legacy of imperialism in Somalia and its surrounding contiguous states. The divisions that were sown during the colonial period between Italy, Britain, and France, the war and conflicts with neighboring Ethiopia, and also the problems related to the political trajectory in Kenya, neighboring Kenya. Kenya being the largest economy in the East Africa region. However, at the same time, they have very close ties with the United States and the overall system of international finance capital. We saw in Kenya just recently demonstrations against the arbitrary lifting of taxes, impacting particularly young people inside of Kenya. We saw those demonstrations crushed ruthlessly by the Kenyan state. And there's close cooperation between Washington and Nairobi. The Kenyan police have deployed over 1,000 of their personnel to the Caribbean nation of Haiti, ostensibly on a peacekeeping mission. So the interference of the U.S. and the other European powers that have a history of colonialism and imperialism on the continent are at the root of these divisions and these conflicts. You have that compounded by climate change, the impact of climate change, where Somalia contributes almost nothing to greenhouse gas emissions globally. Yet the United States is the major force, the major player in the problems associated with climate change. And we know the Pentagon, there's been studies done that shows that the U.S. Department of Defense, their personnel and their bases around the world, their soldiers, warships, aircraft carriers, all of that are the largest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So we have the dominance of imperialism impacting not just Somalia, but the entire African continent and indeed the entire international community. We see all these severe weather events that are taking place in Africa, of course, in West Africa, Central Africa in the last couple of weeks, but also in East Africa, widespread drought. All of this is taking place, yet nothing is really being done by the real culprits that are fostering the climate change, severe weather events. Every year, the United Nations has a climate conference in some location internationally. They even had one in Egypt a couple of years ago. They've had it in the UAE. Yet they dominate the discussion, despite the fact that they're way outnumbered. The global South, the nation states, as well as the territories, far outnumber the United States and Western Europe. Yet they're able to dominate discussions, to veto language and resolutions in order to ensure that their profit system is not interfered with in regard to concerns about severe weather events. So, yeah, I think it all goes back to the control of the imperialist system over the overwhelming majority of people throughout the world.
Definitely. And the African Union UN mission in Somalia is transitioned from a so-called peacekeeping mission to a so-called stabilization mission. How effective do you think this presence has been in promoting peace and unity in Somalia, and what new difficulties have arisen from these shifts?
It's been a very long operation for the African Union there. Much of the resources, whether it's weapons, training, even salaries, are being supplied by the European Union and the U.S. So that should give you an idea of the character of the operation. It's not a African Union funded and independent mission in Somalia. It is largely being controlled by the Western imperialist states. They have had some success in terms of curtailing the operations of al-Shabaab. Nonetheless, there's still insecurity inside the country. What we'll have to see is that at the end of this year, whether or not this mission is going to be extended for another year or some period of time, and how effective it is going to be. It's not assisting anyone in Somalia to have this ongoing instability taking place. Any potential that the country has in regard to its geostrategic position in regard to the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, the Indian Ocean, and so forth, and also its oil potential. For many, many decades, it's been discussed that Somalia has considerable oil resources, yet they have not been able to be exploited to the degree that the people inside the country can raise their standard of living. So it's a very critical situation as far as the Somalian people are concerned, and what happens there impacts the entire Horn of Africa and East Africa region.
Indeed, it's very, very crucial to the region. And Somalia has taken a firm stance against corporations recognizing Somaliland as independent. I was wondering, how do you think this will influence international business operations in the region, and what economic implications could arise from this?
It's going to make it much more complicated for any corporation to do business or to sign agreements with Somaliland if they're being monitored by the central government in Mogadishu. And it could cause tensions They could bar these corporations from doing business inside of Somalia, the area that's controlled by the federal government. So these are some of the potential problems that would arise if there's a stampede of forces, economic and state actors that want to openly conduct business and have relations with the government in Somaliland.
Definitely. And how do the disputes between Ethiopia and Egypt, and you mentioned, and particularly, I guess, over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project, the GERD, how do they intersect with the current issues involving Somalia and Somaliland? If you could go into that in a little bit more detail.
Yes, because there were reports several weeks ago that Egypt had agreed to supply military assistance to the government in Somalia, which arose as a result of that tensions, even further tensions between Ethiopia and Egypt. And of course, it's concern as well as it relates to Somaliland, because you don't know, or it could be suspicions that there's a plan for some type of military intervention in Somaliland, which I believe would be disastrous for the central government to conduct. But apparently, there is some effort underway to strengthen the Somalian military apparatus, independent of the African Union mission, which has been there now for some 17 years.
That would be, that definitely would be disastrous. In your opinion, what steps should be taken by Somalia and other countries in the region to address the ongoing tensions and work towards a more unified and stable Horn of Africa?
There needs to be a working group established. Of course, the African Union has their Peace and Security Council. There's also the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, EGAD, which is the East African organization. There's the East African Community. There's COMESA, the community of East African, Central African, and Southern African states. So yes, all these groups need to be consulting with the African Union to prevent a further deterioration in relationships between all of these state actors, whether it's Somalia and Ethiopia, Ethiopia and Egypt, and also the breakaway region of Somaliland, to ensure that there be some understanding between the central government and the neighboring government of Ethiopia, which is under a lot of pressure to open up access to waterways where trade can be further facilitated. And not to mention the internal problems that are going on even now inside of Ethiopia. But independent of that, the country, the central government of the country needs access to waterways, and that has been an ongoing concern for decades upon decades in Ethiopia.
Absolutely. And yet your article highlights the need for unity in the struggle against imperialism in Africa and West Asia. So kind of along the same lines as that last question, how could a guiding Pan-African foreign policy help mitigate the conflicts within Somalia and among neighboring states like Ethiopia and Egypt?
The enforcement of the already existing provisions within the African Union, if they were implemented, could go a long ways to guiding the continent towards a unified mechanism of governance and relations. So we always have to raise the necessity of unity independent of imperialism, because eventually the continent will have to move against the imperialist system, against international finance capital, and against the world capitalist system, because the world capitalist system was built upon the enslavement and colonization of African people, largely. So in order for that process to be reversed, there has to be a new world international economic order. Prior to the 15th century, the center of the world economy was not in Western Europe, was not in North America. It was along what is known as the Indian Ocean Basin, which is North, South, Southern Africa, stretching across to West Asia, Central and Southern Asia, and even the South Pacific. You see the formations of institutions such as BRICS, such as the Non-Aligned Movement. All of these institutions, FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, all these formations, even though they're having a limited impact at this stage, they prefigure the formation of a new world system. And that's why the U.S. is so concerned about these new formations. France, for example, as well, requested at the last meeting to join BRICS. Seems ridiculous, but they were turned down. But they are concerned about the vast majority of the population throughout the world that encompasses the major resources, natural resources that are needed to run the modern technological and economic systems, being in control of the people themselves. So that's why there's a lot of propaganda against China, a lot of propaganda against the Russian Federation, against Iran, because these nation states are perceived as strategic competitors with the United States, even strategic adversaries in the case of Russia, China, and Iran. And you see how they categorize, for example, the resistance movements in West Asia as Iranian proxies. This is all designed to justify their ongoing and unconditional support to the state of Israel. The same thing in regard to the regimes in Africa, which they support, and they want to control even countries like Niger because they have large deposits of uranium. The U.S. wants military installations there, and they want to make sure that they continue to dominate the Sahel region in West Africa and all other parts of the African continent. So this is the struggle that's going on right now. In order to be victorious, there has to be a unity and a unification of Africa.
Absolutely. That's very well said. And those are all of the questions I have for you today. Is there anything else you wanted to add or discuss before we close?
Well, just to say that this coming week is going to be the United Nations General Assembly debate, where all of the heads of state come and put forward their positions on the global situation. So we should listen very carefully in New York City at those deliberations, because you'll hear the state of Palestine, you'll hear South Africa, the Russian Federation, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the People's Republic of China, Zimbabwe, Egypt. All of these countries will be represented. And you can judge the tone of even the governments that are out of touch with the people. In many cases, in some instances, they do reflect the mass sentiment of the people in regard to what's happening now in Palestine, the need to lift sanctions and the embargo on Cuba, the need to lift sanctions against Zimbabwe, the need to make a serious effort to curtail the impact of climate change, and also the unequal exchange and unequal power relationships between the capitalist countries and the global South. So we should listen very carefully this coming week at the United Nations General Assembly.
For sure. I will be tuning in to do just as you said. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming back on the show again. And,
Right.
We look forward to having you back soon.
It'll be my pleasure.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.